Hello and welcome. My name is Manuel Quintana, Training Manager here at AdventureWorks. And in today's video, I want to see if I can help you to stand up a secure, cheap, inexpensive method of you having sample data at your disposal so that you can do whatever you like, right? If you've gone into our on-demand learning platform or some of these various YouTube videos, quite often we provide you with resources that you can connect to, like Azure SQL Database, Azure Data Lake, some form of a storage account. Sometimes we just provide you some files so you can leverage, and it allows you to follow along with our examples, which is hopefully we think helpful. But there's going to be some times when you just want to kind of go off on your own and do your own exploration. Or maybe you hop into a video that's like, hey, you need to make sure you have this type of database in Azure SQL DB if you want to follow along. Well, what does that process look like? So that's what we're going to do in today's video. We're going to look at standing up very quickly a super basic a logical Azure SQL Server, and we're going to attach a sample Azure SQL database to it. It's going to be the AdventureWorks LT. That'll be the focus of the video. I'll add some additional items at the end there saying, hey, now you know how to do this real quick and simple, but if you wanted to add some additional items, here are some possible routes. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Do remember, this is from the idea and concept of just kind of provisioning something for demo sample usage. It's not really the mindset that we would do for employing, let's say, like a production Azure SQL database for consumption. That can, of course, be found in our training on our on-demand learning platform, which I'll make sure to reference near at the end as well. But let's see how you yourself can have your own Azure SQL database for as cheap as $5 a month that you can access, interact with, and use effectively with any and all Azure services to your heart's desire. So let's head on over and check it out. So here we are, just over inside my browser of choice. I'm in the Azure portal. And like I said, we're going to take a very simple rudimentary approach on provisioning this. There are some elements here that aren't completely covered, but as mentioned, we do have other classes in our on-demand learning platform where we talk about Azure Storage, basically Azure Data Basics. So if you need to go in there, but I'll do a very cursory explanation of what we're going to be doing, which is having a resource group, which you can see, I already have a resource group here, right? This is a super basic element. You can create a resource group in the region of choice. There is no cost for a resource group. It's just an organizational container. Within this resource group, I actually have a storage account, but you don't really need this for now. For the primary demo we're going to be doing, we're literally just going to create a new Azure, a logical SQL Server, an Azure SQL Server. It needs to go in a resource group, so I've created it here, but you could create it as part of the SQL Server creation. And then once that's been provisioned, we're going to add in the sample database. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the access and security. Like I said, we want to make it secure, but it definitely is an approach of like kind of a, this is your sample information. This is stuff that you can work with, right? If you want to further extend that out, that's definitely going to be some additional learning and knowledge, which we do have in our training site that you can look into, right? How can I add other Active Directory or Entra users to this, right? How can I limit the access of a new user account to one specific database, basically a contained database user? These are things we cover in some of our content in our on-demand learning account. So let's go ahead. I'm in this resource group, so I'm literally going to hit create resource, right? You can do this here from the all resources option, right? Let me make sure we have that here. You can go over here to all services, create a resource, but I'm in this resource group, so I'm just going to hit create here. It brings me up my entire marketplace of choices. And I'm going to go here and look for my Azure SQL Server, right? Just going to search that. A couple of options will probably come up. You can always say Azure Services Only, which will really shrink this down away from the third-party providers. But what we're looking for is a SQL Server, right? And logical server. That's what I want to connect to. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and select. So I go ahead, choose it, and I'm going to hit create. Really no other option at this stage. And this is where we have to move through the process of provisioning an Azure SQL Server here. There are quite a few choices, but we're just going to hone in the basics just so you can get this provisioned, like I said, from a demo perspective. By default, when we leave kind of some of the default settings of a SQL Server, it's actually inaccessible by anything external. You can't connect to it with SSMS. You can't connect to it with anything outside your organizational. It's actually pretty locked down, right? There's some choices you could make to open that up, and we'll look at that. But just know, like, one, there's no cost for a logical server at all. And by default, it really doesn't have accessible points to anything external. You would have to go through and actually explicitly do this, which we will do for ourselves, right? So first is first. Let's go through here. I've got my subscription. You'll need to pick a valid one. I've got that same resource group that I've already created that I showed you that I had. Nothing special there. You can create one new if you'd like. And the server details, we just need to give it a name, right? And in here, we can go ahead and say something like, I'm going to put PW, YouTube, and then demo DB or something like that. I'm going to put, anything that's valid here. Let's see. Oh, that's right. It can only contain lowercase. I always get excited sometimes and I put those uppercase items in there. So let me go ahead and remedy that. Just going to keep the same thing, just lowercase in there. We can see check marks across the board. I'm going to keep it with East US as that's going to be exactly where we're at. So it works for me. Choose your region in question. Authentication method, right? Use Microsoft Entra only. That's generally a very best practice, but you can also do both SQL and Microsoft Entra. If you do this, you'll see that we have a couple of options that open up here. One, who is your Entra admin? So you can only pick one, but I'm going to go ahead and select myself. Once we add this into the fact, so I find myself here, I can add myself. You can see we could add multiple people with this selection, but for us, for demo purposes, we're just going to add ourselves, right? This is for me to use this for demo things. And if you wanted to, we could technically add in a SQL Server login. Maybe if you want to kind of distribute this to someone else or something of that nature, you could. This is an admin login. So I'm going to do something like admin user. And then I'm going to go ahead and just use some sort of generic password. You can literally set this however you see fit. Because we will be the creators of this logical SQL server, we'll have access to basically the configurations of this server, which means if somehow you forget the password, we actually have the ability of resetting that. So we could, but I'm there. I'm going to move over to the network section. And this is a pretty important one, right? It's saying basically allow Azure services and resources to access this server. You can see basically, as I mentioned, this is effectively locked down for access by default. But if we flip this switch, any services that are effectively part of this same tenant, so part of this same subscription, it's going to be able to access this. So it just does streamline the process. It does keep it secure, so it's only Azure services within this actual subscription itself. So that can be helpful, right? So I'm going to turn it on because let's say I want to use this with Azure Data Factory, something of that nature. This will be something we would want to leverage, but you can make that choice. For security purposes, you can see that we could turn on managed identity here. Not something we're going to go into within this very quick video here, but managed identity can as well kind of provide you more options when we want to grant access for this SQL Server. If it needs to be granted access to another service, we can actually say, I want to grant that SQL Server access over here, and there is a managed identity, effectively a unique identifier to showcase this, almost like it's one of us in our Entra directory, right? It's a managed identity, a system provided one, or if you've gone through the efforts and you created a user defined managed identity, you could go that route too. But like I said, for the sake of this class, these are more advanced things, some things you would definitely consider for production workloads. Definitely check that out on our training platform. So we're going to omit and not really do anything in the security section under additional settings. We're not going to go with Defender for SQL. There is a cost to this. So once again, more for considerations for a production instance. And we won't do any tags, but it might be required from your organization to do this. But all we did was really turn on the element of Azure resources. That's it. So I can go to review and create at the bottom. It validates that everything's okay. You can see no additional charges. It's a logical server. There's not really taking up any resources. But this is going to be the container, right, that is going to house our database, or eventually potentially databases, right? You can associate multiple databases with a logical Azure SQL Server. So that's what we're going to be doing right now. It's going through the process. It's not a very long deployment process, but when it's all said and done, we will have something that we can go into, check the configurations, and most importantly, add a sample database to the mix here. So let's give this a moment, and when we return, this will be deployed and we can move forward. All right, my resource has been created, so it's available to us. I can go back to my dashboard where I was keeping my resource group, and we can see there is my SQL Server, right? We can go in there. Once again, there's no cost to it. It's a logical server. It's running. It's available to us. And as you can see, we can create a database. You can import a database. I'll talk about that. And if you wanted to control certain settings, you absolutely can. We will look at the security section here in a little bit because there's going to be an impact. Like I mentioned, we're pretty much locked down, and we'll see that in a moment. But allow Azure services. Let's say you decide you don't want to do this anymore. You can simply uncheck that. So here's our information. This is how potentially we can connect. We don't have a database. The whole point is to get a sample database. So the route we can go in order to leverage a sample database that's just readily available with no extra effort and work is literally we can go into the option here of creating a database. And you do need to go through the creation process. Now, this is important, right? This is where there's actually cost associated with what we create. So this is where we have to pay close attention. And it should be noted, like other pay-as-you-go services within Azure, you can scale this up or down. There are quite a few choices to be made here, so you do potentially want to make other considerations when thinking about something like a production-based Azure SQL database. But once again, we're going to take a very standard, basic approach, low-cost approach for a sample database here. So of course, we do need to give a database name. So I'm going to call this AdventureWorks, and you'll see why. LT. That's going to be our database name. It's automatically tied to this server because we're creating within that server. We don't, for this case, no elastic pools needed. We're going to leave this as development, but here's the critical piece: compute and storage. This is where we decide if it's going to be serverless, is it going to be provisioned resources. This is where the cost comes in. Do I want provisioned or serverless? All this has an impact. Like I said, there's more discussion to be had here, which we do go into in our learning. But for this case, if we want to do something simple, we're going to make it cheap, inexpensive. We're going to leave it as being, you could go probably serverless here and go to the basic option, because you notice I have this option right here. When I change that to basic, that's the biggest thing, hitting this, you can get lower on the vCore based pricing, but it's still going to be more expensive than the standard as well as budget. But budget, as you can see, for the sake of what's going to be available to us inside this sample database, 2 gigabytes is plenty, and the 5 DTUs should be sufficient for just me as an individual working against this data. It will actually be fine, right? And once again, as we mentioned, if you are going to expand this, if you're going to need more storage, if you're going to load more databases, if you're going to load more data into tables in this database, then you might have to scale this forward, which you can do. You can switch it from a basic to maybe a standard S0 or a standard S1, and that would increase the cost, right? If we went over here and switched this to standard, and now we can go ahead and say, you know what, I need more 250 gigs. You can see we've gone from the $5 a month to the $14.72 a month. So still keeping it relatively low cost. And as mentioned, you can really change this whenever you see fit, right? So for us, for this demo, we're going to keep it as inexpensive as possible. It's just us working with a database. And we can go ahead and hit apply, which will bring us back to the database creation screen. And then all we need to do is continue through the steps. As far as networking goes, once again, there may be, some of these are actually controlled by the server. Notice, allow Azure services, grayed out. It is controlled at the server level, right? Add current IP address to have access. This is actually something that could be pertinent, right? We're going to talk about that depending on how you're trying to use this. But nothing's going to be able to really access this other than Azure services, and you'll see. And it's because we have to specify what IP addresses will have access. In our scenario where we create like publicly available resources, we create an IP range of 0.0.0.0, 4 of them, might have gone too far there, through 255.255.255.255. It basically open up the door for all valid IP addresses. So that's what we do. That's for sharing it with every one of you guys. But for you, for this individual, we'll get into adding your own individual client IP address, because that's all you'll really need in this regard. So really nothing for now that we're going to do here. Security also, some of it inherited from the server side. Once again, there's the Defender, which is an added cost. So we won't need to do anything for this basic scenario. The additional settings is where we will find the option. You can technically back up from basically any other Azure SQL Server, any other database that you have accessible. You could technically take that database and back it up over here. But what we're going to do is go into the sample section, and it's going to create the AdventureWorks LT will be created, right? So it says it's going to go ahead and modify the compute and storage to be basically able to handle this. But you'll notice when I hit OK, if I go back over to basics, we're still sitting at our standard basic, because that is sufficient, right? It's not going to cause any issues there. That's what we want to add this AdventureWorks LT. Like I said, we don't have to do anything. And with that being said, we can go ahead and hit review and create. It's going to cost $5 a month. Go ahead and hit create, which, like I said, you can delete this at any point in time. You can get rid of it at any point in time, but pretty cheap, pretty inexpensive. And now we're going to have a bunch of different tables. There are, I believe, some stored procedures in here too, and some views that we can tinker around with. And because we have added ourselves as the admins, the Entra admins, and technically there is a SQL Server admin account we know and could use, that gives us basically access into this database. So if you want to create new objects, if you want to drop or delete stuff, right? That's the idea. A space that is safe, a space that won't affect any sort of production workloads, just something isolated that you can practice your skill sets, do different demos and scenarios. Maybe you're in Power BI and you just want to use something simple and basic that you can be in control of to bring into your Power BI reports. Here's a nice, easy example. So let's give this a moment to provision, and then we will look at what we have available to us. All right, and there we go. Our database says it's ready to go. So technically now, right, you could just hit go to resource, but I'm going to kind of reset this. I'm going to go into my resource group. Let me do a quick refresh on this. My database should show up here. As mentioned, if you wanted to make any changes or adjustments, you could. All we need to do is go over here into the compute and storage and be like, oh, I want to scale this up or I want to scale it down. So in theory, right, this is here. we should be able to use this. I'm going to show an example. I'm going to go here and grab my server name. We know that my Entra is the admin here, so let's take a look here, right? I have SQL Server Management Studios. I'm going to attempt to connect. So we're going to connect. I'm going to go ahead and paste in the very connection of our server right there. And I'm going to try to do Microsoft Entra. We have multi-factor authentication, so I'm going to choose Entra with MFA, and I'm going to put in my credentials, right? This is what I set as being the admin, so we should be able to connect here. It should, of course, prompt me for single sign-on, so I'll give that an opportunity. Boom, there it is. And then it should return me back over here to the actual item, and it says your IP address does not have access to the server. So despite us making ourselves admins, as I mentioned, that SQL Server is effectively locked down. The only thing we've opened up is potentially Azure services, so like something like ADF we could go through, but this is to show you it is locked down. So if I wanted to be able to connect, if I wanted to be able to do this, right, we would have to return back to our settings. So if I go right back over here, we need to go to that server. Remember, some of these settings are controlled at the server level. There is an area here. You can see if we go into security, but we don't see the element for like the firewall rules. But if I go over to the server name and we access networking, we can see we have the ability of adding our client IP address, right? So right down here, it's kind of picking up my information, and I can say, hey, yeah, I want to add myself, right? You can have that there. It's actually showing kind of an odd item here. Let's take a look here. 1 second. So what we're seeing here is it may have it set for you. What we're seeing actually here, and you can tell due to the length of this is actually known as the IPv6 address. So that's what we're seeing there. So it's not, this requires your IPv4. So what you could do is there's pretty popular sites like what is my IP address, things like this that you can go into. And we need to find our IPv4 address, which is what it's asking for. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the one that is currently set for the demo machine I'm using. And I'm going to go ahead and paste this over here, right? You just do that in the actual start as well as the end. We just paste this right in here, and then we can hit save, right? So we've added a rule to our firewall where I want everything locked down except for communications coming from this IPv4 address. So with that, just us adding that into the mix there, we can take and go over here where it wasn't working. And now when I hit connect, it just goes through. And as a result, we can also see the respective database, right? Here it is with all of its tables. Give it a moment to expand. Like I said, there's views, there's tables, but we are now just working with some nice sample data that's been available to us. And like I said, we are responsible, we are in control of this, and we can use it as we see fit. So you can see it's just taking a moment here to expand the tables. We'll give that a second. There we go. Nothing too crazy. And this is, at this point, just working with some tabular data right here. So just running a SQL statement, like I said. And if you want to kind of increase performance, you could, of course, scale it up. But you can see here my tables. It works perfectly fine. We now have stuff to work with, and we've locked it down. So it's only going to be working with our IP address because of how we have set up these rules. So right there with that information, we now have a SQL Server with sample data inside of an AdventureWorks LT database, and you are good to go. $5 a month. We've locked it down, so it's only available from our IP address. We did turn on Azure services. Remember, that's something you can easily just toggle off if you'd like. Maybe if you know you're just going to be doing stuff with SQL, then you turn it off, right? Or if you want to be working with Azure services, that just makes it a little bit more convenient. Now, real quick, I mentioned I would add a couple of additional items. If you are interested, if you want to add more, like, okay, that's a good sample database, but I would like a little bit more. I have a database on my local SQL Server. Most times you can migrate those. Of course, there are some nuances and differences when you talk about supported capabilities within, like, let's say, a SQL Server 2019, 2020, whatever you have, those databases for on-prem, the underlying elements of an Azure SQL database is a little bit different. But SQL Server Management Studios, let's say I want this data warehouse, I can right-click this, go under Task, and you'll see there is an option that'll walk you through a wizard to say Deploy Database to Microsoft Azure SQL DB. You basically just have to go through the motions, input of course, the server you want to migrate to, got to put in credentials to have access, right? Administrative level access. And technically, this could walk through a process of migrating something from my local SQL database there, as long as the compatibility is present. Another option that you could consider as well is something called the Azure Data Migration Assistant. You can see it's right here. I want to do an assessment, check the compatibility of potentially moving a database from my on-prem to the Azure SQL DB. You could do that, or you can just straight up do a migration. You can see it gives you source types and it gives you target types, with Azure SQL Database being one of those. And lastly, if you do locate, right, this is going to be something that I started the session with. If you do locate what's known as a backpack file, BACPAC, this is the backup file type for Azure SQL databases. You can find these, you can download them online. So like something like Worldwide Importers, I located, found it, and what I've done is I've stored it right in this data lake. That's the key thing. You do need to store it in a data lake, and it's right here. It's a backpack file. So now what I can do is I can go into my actual SQL Server and say, I want to import a database. And it literally just walks me through the motion. Say, okay, tell me which storage account you have, which I can go ahead and pull the very same one I was just pointing to you. Point to the container. So here's my backpack file. So now I have the file is selected. What is the standard of compute and storage for your database? Remember, this is where the cost comes into play. So once again, you could come in here and say, oh, you know what? I'm going to stick to what I've been doing and use a basic one as well, right? We'll just keep it to that. You have to be aware, of course, there's only 2 GB of space on that basic. So depending on what you're trying to do here, you might have to consider it, but then you just give it a name. This is literally it. You just go through these motions, provide an administrative account that has access. So in this case, we added our Entra ID. So we would just supply that password and you can just hit OK. And with that, you will start that process and you will have created a second database tied to this logical SQL Server that now you have access to data. So you can just use the sample data that's existent inside of the actual process for creating a database within the Azure SQL Server, the AdventureWorks LT. You could use some of the cool features built into things like SQL Server Management Studio, or even Azure Data Studio has some cool things there too. There's the Data Migration Assistant. And lastly, we just kind of showed how if you just locate a backpack style file, you can go ahead and upload that into a storage account and then import it into your SQL Server, adding another database that you will have access to. So multiple different ways, cool things we can do. This is all in your control, right? That's the idea. Obviously, you need to have the ability and the permissions within your organization to be able to create a SQL Server. And of course, you want to make sure you're managing that cost. But I've shown you $5 a month. That's all that's going to be. And potentially you could add more. So if I had a second database, obviously that's another $5 a month. So 10 cumulatively, right? It's going to be additive. So you have to be considerate here. It is a pay-as-you-go service. That is Azure. So always be paying attention to that. But super quick, super simple way to stand up a very secure SQL Server and some sample data that you can just start using however you see fit. So hopefully you enjoyed. Like I said, if you want to get any deeper learning and understanding, don't forget we have our training on the on-demand learning platform, and we absolutely cover a little more in depth on Azure SQL Database and other storage options there. As always, I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.